Hey everyone, Coach Mike here, and welcome back to another episode of the Language of Leadership podcast. I'm joined today by Dao Pham. Anne, how are you doing today in sunny California?
I'm wonderful. Thank you so much for having me on your podcast.
And we're super grateful to have you here today. You have been an incredible leader as the Vice President of Product and Program Management at Edmunds.com, and you've been focused on leading technical projects to completion for over 2 decades. You've been described as a servant leader at Edmunds. So while your list of personal accomplishments is impressive, you'll never see her shine the spotlight on herself. You have incredible accolades from authors and luminaries in the field, such as Robert Cialdini, who described your work as a rare gift to project managers. We're super excited to have you here today. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Could you give us just a very brief introduction into your background and how you arrived at where we are today?
Sure. I am a first generation Vietnamese American. So my parents actually immigrated from Vietnam just 3 days before Saigon fell in 1975. And at that time, my sister was 18 months old. I was not yet born. When they eventually landed to the US by way of Guam and France, my dad actually found a job listing through a newspaper and landed a job as a draftsman at the state of California in Sacramento. And that's where I was born and raised. So I very much empathize with people who have Asian parents and have gone through struggles. But I was really the lucky one. So I was the youngest in my family, and my parents really endured a lot of hardship to get us there. My sister had an adjustment to make coming over to the US, but really I was very sheltered as a child. And while we were not rich or wealthy, my parents really provided me everything that I needed. And in exchange for that, they just expected me to excel at the work that I did. So I was expected to get straight A's and overachieve. And I did for the most part. You know, I was a straight A student. I did everything that I thought was going to please them. When my sister achieved things, and I tried to follow in her footsteps as her being a role model to me. And I ended up graduating valedictorian in high school. I went to public school at UCLA for college as a math major. And then I stumbled actually on technology because at the time I was really good at math and I didn't know what I wanted to do with myself. But I knew I didn't want to be an accountant. And I didn't want to work with money. And I did like teaching math, but I didn't think it was going to pay the bills. And I thought my parents would be pretty upset with me if I didn't achieve for more. So I went into technology and did IT consulting and have really done that for the last 20 years. I worked at Deloitte Consulting as a consultant initially. I worked in another consulting company after that. I ended up at Ticketmaster for several years where I met my husband. Then I went to a startup, and now I work for Edmunds, and I've been here for a little bit over 11 years. So I've had a pretty long career in technology, and now I've had 20 years in project management, and I also work in product development, really in software development, building products for our website.
And thank you for walking us through not only your personal and educational background and also your professional journey, which I know we're going to be very lucky to hear some lessons from those learnings a little bit later on today's chat. You shared with us a little bit about your parents and your sister who really sound like positive leadership influences in you growing up. Could we dive a little deeper into that and hear a little bit more about leadership influences, both growing up as well as just earlier in your career?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I would say very early when I was young, my biggest leadership influences were my parents and my sister. So my parents immigrated. They worked very hard to reestablish themselves. My dad was a big believer in the American dream and was one of the first Vietnamese Americans in Sacramento to open a small business. He actually helped get my mom the ability to relicense herself as a pharmacist in the US, which paved the way for other pharmacists. They just worked really hard to do things that they wanted to do, but they really felt they were believers in the American dream and our ability to achieve more as their children. My sister, on the other hand, was an overachiever when she was in elementary school, similar expectations and similar results. She was a spelling bee champ in the fifth grade. I tried to follow in her footsteps, but I was not very good at spelling. I was much better at math. And she played the violin when she was in the fifth grade, and I went on to play the violin after that. That was one of the things that I loved as a child. And then she also won a speech competition when she was in the fifth grade, the very first speech competition for our elementary school. It was rare because she was a minority, but the speech was Martin Luther King Jr.'s "I Have a Dream" speech, which is really famous and extremely inspiring. And when she went to memorize that speech as a child, when she was trained to compete, I actually memorized it too. So when she went to compete, after that, I tried to compete. It took me a couple of years to actually win that competition, but I eventually won it as well. But one of the things that's really great about that speech is that it talks about equality and the ability for people to work together. And so as a very young child, it was ingrained in me that cultural differences were to be embraced and that we should be able to work together, and that is the American dream. And I think that I've always carried that through with me into my career since then. I have a firm belief that you can figure out how to work with anybody and that cultural differences are good. And I think that that's really done me well in my career as a leader working on teams, because everybody is different and everybody brings something special.
Well, Anne, I think you know how I already feel about speech and moot court and debate, but it's wonderful to speak with another person who had such a positive experience there. And I think what you're sharing about not only Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s speech, but just generally those type of events, which is powerful, is that they also teach us how to be good listeners. They teach us how to be open to the diverse backgrounds of other people, not just us blabbing on the stage.
Yeah, I mean, it's a wonderful skill to be able to get up in front of somebody, or a large audience. At the time, our school was not huge, but I think we were 400 or 500 kids. So when you won the speech, you had to get up in front of the entire school and give that speech, and that is something that you don't get a lot of opportunity to do in a lot of education. And so I think that that's really wonderful, because later in your career, if you're going to be a leader, you need to be able to present in front of people and convey your ideas in a way that's emotional and connects with people. So that's really wonderful. And then also seeing different people being able to get up there and speak from different cultural backgrounds, I think is also wonderful as role models.
Well, Anne, it sounds as though you've taken all those skills that you learned as a student and then really combine them with your interest for mathematics and process. And one of the amazing results of all this is the book you recently published, Glue: How Project Leaders Create Cohesive, Engaged, High-Performing Teams. And something that really stood out to me just from the very beginning of the book, and as I mentioned, you have a great remark from Robert Cialdini, one of the luminaries in the field, and he says that the book helps us move from project management to project leadership. And you open the book talking about a little bit about these differences. Can you walk us through what is the difference between a project manager and a project leader, and how did you come up with this inspiration to help us differentiate between the two?
It's funny because I started out my career as a project manager 15 or 20 years ago now as an official project manager. That was my title. And I really wore that as a badge of honor. I thought of myself as a project manager. It was part of my identity. And I would go on to manage lots and lots of projects. At Ticketmaster, I think over 100 different projects, working with big companies like American Express or Apple to do these huge integrations. And one thing that I realized, though, later in my career when I started managing people was that the way that I approached problems was actually fairly different than other project managers. A lot of people will tell me, like, you are just really different than other project managers that I worked with. And I didn't fully make the connection, but I knew that I read a lot about project management methodologies, and they're very highly process oriented. So if you become a project manager or you research project management, it talks a lot about making things efficient, and they define a lot of different processes to get things done. Like first you do step A and then step B and then step C, and it's kind of all mapped out. And the role is often defined as somebody who, basically enforces those steps and takes people through that path. I have always had a much more fluid approach and have never really really fully adopted any particular methodology. It's always been very people oriented. So like I said, very early in my childhood, I had a strong sense that, I wanted to connect with people and I wanted to work well with people. And so everything I do is much more personalized than that. So actually, relatively recently, a little bit before I read the book, I started thinking about making a transition in my career from a project manager into product management, which is about defining products that are going to live on our website. So actually, how do the features going to work? And that's a very different role than project management. And I was having an identity crisis. I was like, hey, I feel like a project manager. How can I leave this role to do something else? And I was speaking with a mentor, and he said to me, you're not just a project manager, you're really a leader. And the difference is that you really take ownership of things. Like, you really lead people and you drive that project, whatever it is, to completion. And you don't have to have a title of project manager to be that. And so it's at that point where that sort of clicked in me, like, oh, maybe I've been a leader all along. And it just happened that my project title was a project manager. And it's not to knock that, but it's to say that you can be a project leader regardless of what your official title is. If you have stepped up to lead the team and lead a project to completion, in whatever cross-functional role you're doing, you can be a project leader. It doesn't have to be that that's your title, and you don't have to follow necessarily a very strict process that's predefined for you to do that. You just have to be really good at working with people and figuring out how to get the best out of them to get things done.
This is a very different approach from what we typically hear. I think, as you alluded to, typically we're thinking project management is checklists and Gantt charts and flow diagrams and flow charts. And not to say that we can't use those tools, but the difference, I think, that you really comes across as the book, and I think is the title of the book, is most people think project managers are simply going through a checklist, where you say project leaders are the glue that binds teams. Walk us through that metaphor, and also, can you share with us? I don't know if you have a copy of the book handy in the house. the
Yeah.
The cover, I think, is so cool. Would you mind?
There
Okay,
it
very
is.
cool. Yeah, would you walk us through a little bit about the idea of what is the glue?
It's funny because when I first started writing the book, I didn't have the name of it. And it actually came out through the course of the book. But one of the things that people would consistently say about me when I worked with them is I was the glue on the project. And so that came out pretty early in the defining of the chapters, that there's this sort of theme of glue in everything I do, which is really about bringing people together and filling gaps that are happening. So one distinction I make between project leadership and project management is that a lot of people will go in, again, with checklists trying to get a process done. But when you're really leading a project, the best thing that you can do is look for places that are not working, where there are gaps, or where there are problems that are incurred, and then try to solve those problems and try to fill those gaps. And when you come in with an approach of, I'm going to help this team do better and do their best, you end up looking for those opportunities and contributing in ways that other people who maybe have some predefined notion of what they're going to do through some sort of process may actually miss. And that ends up being the glue. It's a very personalized approach to project management, where you're looking for how to make things better. And it's a very people-oriented approach. So I do everything. When I talk about being the glue, it means everything from like picking up tasks that need to be done because between person A and person B, somebody forgot to do the thing in the middle. Trying to make sure that handoffs are going well. So like making it so that a gap between one task and another doesn't take too long. Helping to define what the vision of the project is so that everybody feels aligned and they feel much more closely connected in what you're trying to accomplish. And then also the personal element of it. I do a lot, I focus a lot on morale and how the team is feeling. And so a lot of what I do is actually social connectivity. Are we spending some time together to get to know each other? Are we celebrating personal events and making sure that the team is not just a team at work, but they're like a connected team and almost a community or a family? Those are things that actually make this role the glue. And when you focus on those things instead of just, a process or your checklist or your Gantt chart, what you find is your team ends up becoming more high performing because you're doing the things that they can't do or they're missing. And you're just happier and more fulfilled, and your team is happier and more fulfilled in the process.
And on that point, can you share with us a little bit about the magical candy bowl?
This is something that almost everybody has asked me about because it's one of the introductions to the book. One of the things that I start with when I'm leading a team or meeting a new team is building rapport. So if you don't have good relationships with people and you're asking them to get things done, it's just not going to work. They're going to be more resistant. And people tend to want to do a good job, but you need to have a relationship with them and you need to know how to ask them to get them the best out of them. And so one of the things that I started doing actually when I was working at Ticketmaster was I actually wanted to eat a lot of candy myself, but I didn't want to, I didn't want it to go to my waistline. So at the time, Ticketmaster was really close to a Trader Joe's, which I'm not sure if you have that chain where you are, but it's a small grocery store and they have all kinds of wonderful treats. And I remember going there and I started buying them and I thought, I cannot eat these myself. Otherwise, I'm just going to be a blimp. So what I started doing without real intention was I was new to the role and I decided I was just going to start sharing the candy with people. And I was working with a lot of engineers and they were extremely reclusive and didn't want to talk to me, at least initially. But when I came around with candy, well, a lot of people started talking to me. And so it started to become a tradition where I would buy treats, I would share them. It was great because I would get some, they would get some, I would get to know people. And what happened with it, which I didn't intend to do, was that it started to establish me as a giver. So these people that I was going to work with later and would have to ask them to do things for me to help me accomplish a particular project, they started seeing me as somebody who was coming around and giving something to them. And so later on, when I asked them to do something, not only did I have more of a personal connection with them, I also ended up they ended up being more receptive to those requests because they felt like I had given them something. And so they wanted to reciprocate. And this is actually one of the principles in Robert Cialdini's book is that idea of reciprocation, that you give and then people in kind will reciprocate back. Not the same type of task, and you wouldn't even think that that's really a benefit, but it ends up being that way, that you build a great relationship because you're giving something and you're starting with that. And so now I get compliments like when another award was given to me, they quoted me as somebody who knows everybody's favorite snack preferences, which I do. Like when I run a big project, there's always a big snack stock of like, okay, hey guys, what do you want? Okay, you like spicy Cheetos, you like Funyuns, you like Oreos. Like we always have the best snack stash. And that builds a sense of community and an openness. And it also just builds good credibility for me and good relationships with those people. They know that I care enough to actually ask them what they like. And they know that when I'm going to be asking them for something later, that I am doing my best to give them something in exchange. So the magical candy bowl ends up being something that is a fixture on my desk, which is that as like an ongoing principle. But generally speaking, I really like to feed people on my teams, and you would be amazed at how much food makes people happy.
You speak about later in the book as well team dynamics and how they change over time, and how building rapport, building trust might be a first key step we need to take, and then over time the relationships between team members can change. I know that the Brian Tuckerman team dynamics model has some parts about it that people think are accurate and useful, and other people say, hey, there might be some changes or disagreements that we have. And what is your view on team dynamics? How does it work, and how do teams shift over time when you're working on a product or project together?
So Brian Tuckman's model is that one where they talk about the different phases of teams. And I think it goes forming, storming, norming, performing, I believe is how it goes. And I've actually adopted that paradigm quite a bit. I think about it a lot, that teams do go through these cycles. I don't think it's actually that linear. I think teams kind of move in and out of all of those different cycles at different times. And they tend to storm upon forming. So when there's like some catalyst for change that comes in, whether somebody leaves the team or somebody new comes in or somebody gets a promotion or there's a new project that comes into the team will start to storm because whatever was that they knew has changed and they need to figure out how to adjust to that. And so I think that teams are kind of constantly storming. Anytime there's a catalyst for change on the team, you kind of have to watch for, okay, how is this going to change the dynamic of the team? And should we be doing any adjustments? And if you do that well and you watch that, then you can kind of figure out how to bypass the storming phase or at least expedite it so that it's shorter so that you can get more to norming and performing. And so I talk about this tactic in the book that I call working agreements, which is bringing a team together and then simply just asking them, how do you want to work together? And then trying to get them all to agree on some set of guidelines or principles for how they're going to be conducting themselves. And that is in and of itself a living and breathing working agreement where if something changes, you kind of want to go back to it and say, okay, is this still working? Should we adjust? With software development, most teams work in Agile, which means they develop very quickly and iteratively. And so things are constantly changing. And retrospectives is another tool in Agile where you basically bring the team together and talk about how you were doing, what you could do better, what went well, what did not go well, and what you can change. And what I like to do is combine those two things where if you decide to change something, you bring it back to the working agreement and make sure that that's codified so that you can bypass that storming phase again and try to get back quickly into norming. I guess I'd say I wish that there was a phase on the very end of it where a team kind of like morphs past performing into something even more cohesive, like a family unit or a community. And I think that teams that do stay together longer do end up in that phase where you kind of think about a family or a community and it's like, well, they're always storming, but they really care about each other and they figure out a way to get along. And when they know each other really well, they get past those storming phases faster and they get back to a sense of balance and performance much faster as well. And so I try to get them all the way through that into a phase where they are really caring about each other and then, become kind of like a family unit.
During that process of evolution of a team and hopefully getting to that community or family stage where we're having robust and direct challenges, questions, debates. I mean, that's kind of the ideal for working as a team, right? We kind of hash it out together, but then in the end, we're all working towards one goal. You pointed to something in the book, which I think is a really important leadership concept, especially for younger leaders or developing leaders, which is managing or navigating trade-offs. It's an essential leadership skill, and it's difficult because you can't make everyone happy in every instance. Would you mind walking us through, Anne, what your roadmap is or just some ideas and principles you have about navigating those trade-offs when you see them in the workplace?
Yeah, every day is full of trade-offs, especially if you're a leader. So I think I talk about this a lot in the book. Every good project starts with really clear goals. Unambiguous goals, I think, is the phrase that I use. And it's about defining something that everybody is on board with trying to achieve. So, and making it so clear that when you use that, you can use it as an anchor for everything that you're trying to do. And so what happens over the course of a project inevitably is that every day there are going to be choices that you need to make where you're not going to be able to do all the things that everybody wants. And especially if you're trying to deliver under a specific timeline, which all projects have, you want to try to figure out, okay, what's the core thing that I need to do that's going to make the biggest impact against the goal that I'm trying to achieve? And so the guidance that I would give people in general is when you're faced with choices, what you always want to do is tie it back to where you're trying to go and whether or not the things that you're looking at help you boost that goal and what gets you the furthest. In the book, I give like examples where you can use like a different axis of like speed versus, speed versus quality as an example. It's like a classic trade-off. I can either have it fast or I can have it worked well, but I can't necessarily have both in, let's say, a week time frame. And so you need to decide what you're trying to achieve. In a project where the main goal is to get it out the door quickly so that you can be first in market and get learnings quickly, then quality may not matter so much. Eventually it will in terms of product maturity, but you can make decisions like that where you're like, well, really the objective of this is to get it out the door so that I can learn, because I have a long-term goal to have a sustainable product, not to build something that's so robust that by the time I get it out the door, I don't know whether or not customers will even want it. And so I think using those frameworks to make those trade-offs is really helpful, as long as you're always anchoring back to what was the original intention of what I was trying to achieve, and does this thing actually help me achieve that goal? And if you are really connected to what that goal is, you can provide guidance as a leader for those trade-offs intraday. That's where you add a ton of value as a project leader.
Before we jump into some other leadership lessons you've learned in your life, Anne, and what you hope your leadership legacy can be and such, there's one other part of the book that really jumped out to me, which is about note-taking. When I think of note-taking, I think of it sounds like a true glue-like behavior, but one that doesn't get enough airtime and enough respect. When you think of leadership, it's usually going up on the whiteboard or giving a speech or applauding because of this big product release. Yet something you're very clear about in the book, Anne, is leaders take great notes. Can you walk us through what type of note should we be taking and why?
I actually am very passionate about note taking, which is a very funny thing to say, but I feel like it's been so fundamental to my success that I say in the book, I devoted a whole chapter to this. And I learned very early on, actually, when I was going to college at UCLA, I was a really slow reader. And I would have trouble keeping up with courses because there was too much text and I just couldn't get through all of the material in time. And I was a math major, and math majors tend to be lazy, if you know any. It's why we have all these different symbols that we use when we're making calculations. And I had read an article about note taking and how if you take notes in outline format, which is like structured note taking, you tend to retain a lot more. So I started doing that when I was in college. And to my surprise, what I found was when I was going through and doing that, instead of just sort of writing down verbatim what the instructors were saying, I would actually retain a ton more information. So instructors would say something, and what happens is when you're taking it in outline format, you actually try to reorganize the information as you're going, because you're trying to sort of group things in logical places. And when you're doing that, you're processing the information an additional time. Instead of just having it come in your ear, you're thinking about it, then you're sort of organizing the information. And then the third piece of it is then you're writing it down and processing it on paper. I tend to type, so probably most everybody does now instead of pen and paper. But yeah, when you're doing that, you sort of process that information in a different way. And so that skill I carried all the way I've carried in with me into work. And one of the things that people will say as soon as they start working with me is like, wow, you take these great notes. And it's really a part of my learning process that, as I do that, I recall a lot more. It helps me understand when there's gaps, because if I'm organizing it doesn't sort of make sense. How do I get from step A to step B? Then I will identify a question that I ask in that process. So it really helps me as a tool. But what I found is one of the things that happens when you're a project leader is most of the time you don't have grand authority over everybody. So most project leadership happens in the middle of the organization. You're not the CEO. Oftentimes you're not even an executive. You're just a line person who's been asked to lead a project. And in order to get things done, you have to get your power from other places. And what happens is if you take really great notes and you share them, don't keep them to yourself, you actually share them, people start to see you as a source of information. And they say, oh, Anne must know that what the answer to this question was, because she was there and I'm sure she took really good notes. And so the dynamic shifts from I'm just a person here who's sort of like a scribe to somehow I'm inadvertently this person who has all of this knowledge that people could come back to and ask questions of. And, again, going back to the idea of giving, like I'm sharing information with them. They realize that I'm doing something on behalf of them, and then the dynamic shifts so that they come back to me when they need something, and then I can go back to them when I need something, and we start exchanging that way. So it becomes really fundamental to that. And all of that starts with good note taking. So it's like I learn a lot, and I establish documentation for my projects, and somehow I create a source of power that didn't exist before. And people are very receptive to that. Like, it's not a sneaky thing. They see it, they recognize that it's great work. And then it becomes something that helps elevate the entire team.
It has so much more value than simply recording what's going on, as you're saying. I'm curious, really quick, just to dive one step deeper there, and maybe to briefly share one of my own experiences. When I was a middle school student, I think, like many people listening or watching, and I have a sneaking suspicion you were like this as well, we had the ability to remember lots of things. We could remember what our homework was for certain days, or we could remember what the assignment was. We could remember what the teacher said. But then at some point, for me, it was in middle school. For you, maybe it was later, because I'm sure you have a better memory than me. There were just too many moving parts to all of a sudden be able to remember everything. And it was this bittersweet realization that I had one day that I said, okay, I have to use my assignment notebook. I have to use my planner when I love just keeping it in my head. Did you ever experience something like that, where there was kind of a breaking point where you said, there's simply too many things going on, I have to really mark these things down? Or for you, is it more of a gradual transition into this really deep appreciation for notes, the influence you can build within an organization, and the increased efficacy of yourself as an executive because of them?
I don't know that I have like a single point in time that I can point to where I said like, okay, this was the point where my brain was saturated and I couldn't remember anymore. It probably was in college, because you're learning so much at any given time, and the notes really, really did help me. After I started taking notes, my study time actually shortened quite a bit, even for midterms, because I would actually take my notes and then make another version of the notes. So I take all the notes from the course of the quarter, because I was in the quarter system at UCLA. And then I would create a scrib version of the notes, like on 2 sheets of paper. And when I studied for my finals, I'd literally look at those too. And so I think there was a recognition in college that I couldn't remember everything. It had to be written down, and I had to like really study hard for these classes in order to get good grades. So I'd say that. I will say, though, your anecdote resonates a lot with me as a parent. I have 2 small children, and one of the things I found is when they were really young, I thought that they could read because they were smart and they could memorize books. So if it was their favorite book, you would pull it out and it would look like they were reading. I even have pictures where my daughter was sitting in the preschool and she was like pretending to read to her class, where she was like the teacher and they were role playing. And then something funny happened when she actually got to kindergarten and they started giving her harder books. She just melted down. She couldn't memorize all the books anymore. And then she had a really hard time learning how to read, because she had this notion that it should have been easy because it was so easy when she was younger. So I think that transition happens to a lot of people. It's very natural for young children to do that and go through pain as they're going through that transition. And I think the earlier you learn in your childhood that you can't know everything, and that writing things down is extremely useful, and that's not a weakness in any way, the better. And what I will find and say again is that, if you do note taking well, it does actually fundamentally improve your memory, but it has that added value of a lot of people don't take great notes and they don't write things down. And so you will be that person that people come to, and that becomes very powerful.
Well, it's a very powerful lesson. What other leadership lessons have you really taken away and from your journey? What's maybe one or two key things that you remember today that you would want other people to learn from your successes and challenges?
I read this book that's called Great Boss, Dead Boss. It's a very unique title. It's by an author named Ray Immelman, and I had seen him lecture at a project management conference one time. The book itself is not my favorite book in a lot of ways, because of the way it's written. It's written as like an analogy throughout, and it's a story that teaches a ton of lessons. But the lessons have been really powerful and have stayed with me for quite some time. So in that way, I recommend it. And at the end of the book, one of the things that he says that's very compelling to me is that as a leader, your limiting beliefs are actually the limit to your beliefs also limit the potential to anything that you lead. And I find that to be like a very powerful statement. It's like, oh, that's true. If I don't believe that it can happen, it will never happen because I'm the person who's actually leading other people. And so one of the lessons that I've taken away in my career is that you should always look for people who believe that you can do more than you think that you can do. And who like break the ceiling on your belief system, because, if they can see beyond that and they can coach you beyond what you can see, then that will grow you. And then that will also grow your ability to grow everybody else who looks to you for leadership. I think that's such a powerful lesson, and I carry it with me all the time where I'm looking for people who can serve as inspiration or who can challenge my thinking and ask me, are you sure that you can't do that? Like they'll push me a little bit. It's hard to always push yourself, and in particular it's almost impossible if you can't see it. Some people are blessed with the optimism that they can do everything, but a lot of people aren't. And especially when you're young, if your parents were really strict and you're an overachiever, you grow up with a fear of failure. Or I very much grew up with a fear of failure. Like I never want to fail. It's like not in my blood. And so if I see that moment where it's possible for me to fail, it's like, I can't do that. But finding somebody who can tell you, like, first of all, it's okay to fail, because when you do, that's where you know where your limits are. And second of all, it's not a failure until you stop. So you can try and fail once, but that doesn't mean you can't try again. And if you can find people who can tell you, like, yes, you can do that, you can go further, that's going to grow you as well as anybody else that you lead.
That's such a powerful insight, Anne. And I think it's a great reminder to us, whether we're project leaders or teammates or family members or community members, that sometimes it does help to challenge and push our teams and our peer leaders and even senior leaders to think bigger and to think more broadly. I know that for me personally, I tend to generally be a conflict avoidant person if I can help it. I don't like saying to somebody, "Hey, like you can do better. I want to challenge you to do it." I feel like it's almost too assertive or overly like it's not my place to be. But that's such a powerful visual, which is right the limitation that we set for ourselves. Sometimes we need somebody else to really just say, "Hey, maybe you can open that up and think a little bit more broadly."
Yeah, I find the most inspirational people that I meet are those that will challenge and tell me, like, you can do 10 times more than you do. And I'm like in total disbelief. But it really takes somebody who's like pushing you, like, you're thinking way too small. You can think a lot bigger than what you're doing, to get you to those levels. And I think every person that I've encountered has left like a really big imprint on me when they've challenged me to think beyond that. And I think that there's no way that I would be where I am in my career without mentors who helped me see past what I thought were my own limits.
Well, Anne, I know we're just about to wrap up on time here. Would it be possible to share any other thoughts or lessons you'd care to share with our audience and then wrap up with something that you've learned recently as well? Because I know you're an avid leader and learner.
Yeah, so what I would say is one of the things that's the best thing about this time in our lives, and I know there's a lot of hardship happening right now. We have the pandemic that we've been dealing with. One of the best things that I've learned during the pandemic is that it's not limiting our ability to grow. And in fact, we're in a state where there's more information out there than there's ever been. And anything that you want to learn, you can have access to so many resources about it. So there are podcasts like this that are wonderful. There are books, there are articles, there are blogs, there are courses that you can take, that are now just people putting their own thoughts out there. My book actually started out as a self-published endeavor where you can now just self-publish a book if you want to write it. There's no barrier to having to get a traditional publisher to publish you. I ended up getting a traditional publisher, very luckily, but it wasn't something that limited me from doing those things. And we're just in an age right now where there's so much more that's possible, because there's so much information at your fingertips. And so it's hard for me to pinpoint one thing, like one particular fact that I've learned, but one thing that I have generally learned is that anything that I want to learn, I can learn. There are so many resources available to me, and even like communities. So when I was actually trying to go through the process of writing this book, Glue, I didn't know how to write a book. And then I realized there are Facebook books and groups out there that I can join that had other first time authors that were trying to go through the process. There were resources out there in terms of like courses for first time authors, articles, tons of blogs on Medium. I mean, there was just so much information available to me, and that becomes very empowering. So, what I would say to anybody out there is like, outside of just a leadership lesson in general, as people and students and people who are growing infinitely for their lives, you have the ability to continue to learn and grow every day in any subject that you want to learn about. The resources are available. And so take advantage of that, just because you're sitting at home, because you're quarantined or, not going out as much as you were before. It opens up a new world of opportunity in a way that didn't exist before.
That sounds right there like a reminder to think 10 times bigger in terms of our own learning. I
It
think we just
does.
got the kick in the butt that we needed right there.
I hope so. I hope you'll pick up my book, Lou, and read it and to learn something about it. And then I hope it inspires you to write your own book or do something that you didn't think you could achieve before.
And where can we go to learn more about your work and pick up a copy of the book?
Sure. So Glue is available on all major online retailers, Barnes & Noble, Target.com, Amazon.com. Obviously, you can go there to buy the book. It's available in Kindle, paperback, and hardback. And then I think in a couple of months, we'll actually have an audiobook available as well. So I'd love to hear any comments from anybody who is reading the book. I love hearing from readers. And then if you wanted to learn more, I also have a website, www.glueleaders.com. That's GLUELEADERS. You can go there and you can reach out to me directly, contact me with any questions or comments. I'd love to hear from you.
Well, Anne, thank you so much for your time. Wishing you all the best and hoping that we have that we have a significant increase in Glue leaders very shortly.
I hope so too. That would be so wonderful. Thank you for having me, Mike.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.